Thank you for coming out. This being a live streamed event, I am going against my true nature, and we're starting close to on time, which is very, very unlike me. But we're just going to do it. It's fine. All right. No, it's fine. Take your time. We'll get started. Okay, so technology being what it is, if you all can turn your phone to silent or some mode where I'm not entirely aware of what brand of phone you have or the voice that you've chosen for your assistant. Okay. Welcome and thanks for coming out on a nice hot afternoon when one might like to be outside or by the pool. But those of you who are really committed to understanding what's happening to our democracy are most welcome here. Welcome to these summer lectures in democracy reform. I'm Sam Wong, and I'm very, very pleased and honored to introduce Dave Daley. And I'm going to say nice things about Dave just a little bit. And I'm going to say that Dave is a journalist. He is a passionate and informed journalist who does his homework on the subject of our democracy and where it's been and where it may be headed. I think it's often the case that we expect our journalists to not have opinions. Dave is committed to democracy and committed to seeing it work as well as possible, and he sees things, and sometimes people complain, but I would say that, to paraphrase Harry Truman, he tells the truth and they think it feels like hell. And so I would characterize Dave as being like that. He is a son of Connecticut. He's from Hartford. He has, at one point or another, edited the Hartford Courant. He's edited the Salon magazine. He has also, for those of you who like this sort of thing, he's written the liner notes for the REM album Document. And so this is,
It's the end of the world as we know it, and I feel fine.
Yes. And so Dave has done a lot of things, and our plan today is Dave will talk a little bit about his new book project, and then afterwards we'll have discussion, Q&A, and I hope we will talk a little bit about previous books, his books Unrigged and Rat Effed, about reform and redistricting and gerrymandering, respectively. So I hope we'll cover all that, and without further ado, Dave Daley.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you to the Electoral Innovations Lab. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be in Princeton. I think it says amazing things about Princeton that you not only have brilliant neuroscientists who have committed themselves to doing the work for democracy, but an institution that supports that kind of work and a community that clearly comes out and cares about it. So 4 o'clock on a beautiful summer afternoon, and you're all in here. I think I saw that there's rosé outside, so afterwards we can all relax. I want to talk just for a few minutes and try and set the stage of what I'm working on right now, and I think it will be much more interesting, though, to go into conversation with Sam. So I will keep this to just a few minutes and try to tie it all into current events and the headlines that we have seen in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, in the New Yorker, and Vanity Fair. We recognize all of those fonts from being online all day. And those headlines from these recent Supreme Court cases from this last term have suggested that perhaps democracy dodged the worst. Perhaps even hailed the Chief Justice as a hero. There were two crucial cases before the court in this last term. Moore versus Harper, which had to do with something called the independent state legislative theory, which really in its most extreme form could have removed the kinds of checks and balances that have informed American democracy for centuries and allowed state legislatures to really have unfettered control over election laws, freed from state Supreme Courts, freed from state constitutions, free from gubernatorial veto, And as we all know, state legislatures can absolutely be trusted with that power right now. There's certainly no election deniers running amok in some of the closest states in the nation where the presidency was determined in some of these places by 10, 11, 20,000 votes in 2016 and then again in 2020. And then there was another case, Allen v. Milligan, which is also called Merrill v. Milligan, except the Secretary of State of Alabama changed in the middle there, so that case sometimes gets called a couple of different things, but more important than the name is what the case had the potential to do, which was really to upend Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act on redistricting and to really undo what this court has allowed to remain in place of the Voting Rights Act, really the last sliver of it, the Section 2 protections around redistricting. And we, I think, should be grateful for the fact that these decisions went the way that they did. I think we can breathe a sigh of relief, but we are not out of the woods yet. I think it's really too early to know what the consequences of these cases will actually be. I would suggest that the decisions that were reached in both of these cases, the short-term decisions in Moore v. Harper and Allen v. Milligan, that generated these headlines that the media has said, a statesman, democracy survives, that those decisions are in many ways less important than the 2 or 3 page concurrences, both written by Brett Kavanaugh in both of those cases, that suggest inroads for what the next cases will be over the course of the court's next terms. And I would suggest that this has really been the pattern of the Roberts Court over the course of the last dozen or so years, as they have worked to roll back a democracy itself in many ways, over a series of cases that has really remade our electoral system. The Citizens United case from 2010, the Shelby County decision from 2013, the decision on partisan gerrymandering in Rucho versus Common Cause in 2019, that if you're all familiar with the Rocky Horror Picture Show, there's the time warp, it's and John Roberts does his own version of the time warp. It's a step to the right and then a big old jump to the right. And I think what we might have seen here is the first step to the right in these cases, that we are not out of the woods yet. John Roberts did not appear to be on a radical path when he introduced himself to the American people in 2005. He looked like the reasonable dad next door. He appeared almost out of central casting during his confirmation hearings. Gray suit, cherry red tie, 2 kids behind him, both blondes. He delivered his opening statement with no notes, had a blank yellow pad in front of him, perhaps symbolizing an open mind. And he talked about his Indiana boyhood. He talked about growing up, remembering how he would drive past silos and farms that stretched all the way to the horizon. And he talked about America's other civic religion. He talked about baseball. He promised that he would be a mere umpire, that he would be invisible, he would be unseen. He would apply the rules, he would not make the rules. I will remember, John Roberts said, that it's my job to call balls and strikes and not pitch or bat. I come before this committee with no agenda. The role of an umpire and a judge is critical, but it's a limited role. It's a great metaphor, right? It defined him, and it's defined him ever since, I think, in the eyes of the media, because there's a difference, right? There's the beauty of the balls and strikes metaphor, of the umpire metaphor, is it draws a line between a judge and a legislator, one who applies the rules versus one who makes them, but also the difference between an umpire and a player who wants to win or lose, an umpire who doesn't have a rooting interest, who goes out for dinner after the game, regardless of who wins. And so while the Chief Justice really gets praise for his restraint, I would suggest that that's an analogy that disguises a different way of actually acting, and that the legacy instead is going to be defined by Shelby County, by Citizens United, cases that really remade the very promise of American democracy, and by the cases here that are still to come. Again and again, this is a court that has made it easier for the few to rule the many. It's turned majority rule upside down, and it's reworked the law from the bench while pledging fealty to original intent. That these are cases that have transformed campaign finance and fair representation, multiracial democracy. Whether citizens all speak with an equal voice, and that the court has actually sided with its partisan team and with its partisan benefactors time and again, and that the result has been to deliver policy victories, whether in courts or in gerrymandered legislatures that have been allowed to continue, that could not otherwise be won. So that while being seen as an institutionalist, maybe someone putting the brakes on a runaway court, I would suggest that the Chief Justice instead is just a slightly slower driver trying to get to the same destination. He's not stopping arsonists. He's merely pulling out the floorboards rather than dumping gasoline on it all. It has the same result. So that two-step that I talked about, and I won't dance again, I promise. Unless anybody wants to afterwards, there is, again, rosé out there. So there could be dancing. That all of these cases that we've talked about that are so concerning, Citizens United, Shelby County, and Rucho, they all have a case that came just before them that didn't get a lot of attention, but that laid the groundwork for the bigger case that was yet to come. In the Citizens United case, that's something called a Wisconsin right to life, which took the first bite out of McCain-Feingold, the big package of campaign finance reforms, bipartisan reforms that passed in the early 2000s. And effectively, what that did was it allowed for those kinds of issue ads that McCain-Feingold had tried to stop, brought them back. It was the first bite at the apple. The court finished it off in Citizens United. Step before the jump. Northwest Austin is the case that comes before Shelby County. This has to do with a tiny little municipal utility district in Texas. And what they said was, we want out of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, preclearance, which had required states and localities, jurisdictions that had a history of racial discrimination in their voting laws. They had to go to the federal government or to a court in Washington, D.C., and prove before they made any changes that these changes could be trusted. This little board says, we aren't doing anything awful here. We're just a little utility board. Why should we have to follow through and do this? And the court agreed. And what Roberts does in this case is he introduces, he introduces this idea of equal sovereignty among states. And he says, well, what preclearance Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act is doing is it's treating some states differently than other states. And you can't do that. What he writes in Northwest Austin, And he cites a Supreme Court case called Katzenbach from 1966. The doctrine of the equality of states does not bar remedies for local evils which have subsequently appeared. This is what he is grounding his doctrine of equal sovereignty on. But if you actually go back and you take a look, and that slide really is here it is. If you actually take a look at what Katzenbach actually says, it says that there is equal sovereignty among states when it comes to the admittance of states to the Union. But that's it. The doctrine of the equality of states, invoked by South Carolina, does not bar this approach, for that doctrine applies only to the terms upon which states are admitted to the Union and not to the remedies for local evils which have subsequently appeared. The Chief Justice whacks the middle of that out, throws in an ellipsis, inverts the meaning, and lays the groundwork for declaring the Voting Rights Act unconstitutional in the next case when Shelby County comes along 4 years later. So again, it's a step to the right, introducing this idea and then dropping it into the law. And then quoting himself from Northwest Austin in the Shelby County case. It's a very, very clever way of getting things done. You see something similar in the Whitford case, which was a partisan gerrymandering case from Wisconsin that came before the Common Cause versus Rucho case. They found a way to take that case, dismiss it on standing, suggesting that the Wisconsin voters who brought it did not have the ability to actually bring that kind of challenge, really because the Chief Justice knew that Anthony Kennedy was about to retire, that a different court the next year would likely make a different ruling, that this Rucho case from North Carolina was coming up. And so they punted that case with a different court, with different justices. They made a very different ruling. So this brings us to these last two decisions, which I hope you might now look at through a slightly more worried eye than we've looked at them in the media through those other headlines. So here's what Brett Kavanaugh writes in the concurrence in Moore v. Harper, which is being heralded, right, as the court saving democracy, knocking down this wild, crazy theory. In reality, what it said was there may be a need for the court to come in and decide when a state Supreme Court has transgressed, when it has gone too far. State courts do not have free rein. Holds that state courts may not transgress the ordinary bounds of judicial review. So that ought to get us all to say, well, wait a second. What are the ordinary bounds of judicial review and who gets to decide and when are you going to decide that? In the future, Kavanaugh writes, the court should and presumably will distill that general principle into a more specific standard, such as maybe the one advanced by Chief Justice Rehnquist, who is the Chief Justice from 2000 who dropped the original idea of the independent state legislative theory into the Bush versus Gore case. So let's be concerned because this is going to come back to distill that general principle. And we don't know when it's going to come back. We do know, however, that the independent state legislative theory was really at the heart of the big lie in the 2020 election, the idea of how do you overturn an election result? Well, state legislatures say there's been voter fraud or we just can't tell who won, so we're going to pick the electors. And so the fear would be that this kind of case returns sometime between Election Day 2024 and January 6th, 2025. The other interesting case in Allen v. Milligan, what Kavanaugh writes here, I think, is just as concerning because the court, I think, made the right decision in the Alabama case. It was in many ways a textbook Voting Rights Act case. Alabama's 28% black, and white lawmakers drew only one opportunity district for blacks to elect a member of their own choosing. You could very easily have done two, and the court indeed found that. But here's what Kavanaugh writes. And he agrees here with Clarence Thomas that even if Congress in 1982 could constitutionally authorize race-based redistricting under Section 2 for some period of time, the authority to conduct race-based redistricting cannot extend indefinitely into the future. But Alabama didn't raise that argument in this court, so I won't consider it now. But what is that? That is an invitation to bring that case next. And really what that is the Shelby County of Section 2, because what Shelby County did was that the court said things have changed in the South. You can't do the same thing now that you were doing in 1965. This is Justice Kavanaugh saying, well, now it's 2023, it's not 1982 anymore. Maybe we ought to take a look at that. So it didn't take long for Louisiana in the crosshairs of a similar case as Alabama to recognize that challenge and in their own filings say, well, we're going to raise that idea. We think the court ought to take a look at that. So what I would say, we are in a moment in which it's being covered like this. I think we still have got to have our eyes really open. We are not out of the woods yet. There are still threats. We have to be aware of them, talking about them, and not looking away. So thank you.
Okay, Dave, thank you for that cheery presentation.
I danced.
You did. It was a step to the right.
Poorly.
I think it's really important to dance poorly. If your rep is built on writing REM liner notes, then dancing might not necessarily be the thing.
My wife tells me that all the time. Dancing is not your thing, she says.
No, but I thought you looked pretty good. So here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to get into just a little bit of discussion about the Supreme Court, get into some of these points. Before I continue, I just want to point out that things I forgot to point out. This is co-sponsored by the Electoral Innovation Lab. You can read about that excellent organization at electoral-lab.org. The other thing I'll point out is that towards the end of this, I'm hoping to get into a discussion about what Supreme Court actions may do in terms of devolving pro-democracy actions to the states. And so I have this fine book here, and Labyrinth Books is also a partner in this event. And you can go outside after this and take a look at this, and you might want your own copy of this book.
You definitely will.
You definitely wanted a copy of the book. So, Dave, let me start by getting a little bit into some of these issues that you brought up with this two-step process. Are you presenting it as a purposeful long-term strategy or a temporizing measure if he didn't have the votes? Like, tell me, you have an upcoming book on this subject and you've been looking into this. Some would say that's savvy working with the court that he has in order to get what he wants. And so I'm trying to understand, should I think of it as nefarious or should I think of it as savvy?
I think it's both. I think it's absolutely purposeful. I think that this is the strategy in order to get results that, you've got the old metaphor of the frog in boiling in water, and you slowly turn the temperature up on the frog frog and it doesn't even know that it's boiling to death. And I think that that is what the Chief Justice would like to do to American democracy. We are the frog. And he would like to go slowly, but the water gets hotter and hotter. So it's a purposeful strategy instead of turning it all the way over and the frog screams and jumps out of the water and says, whoa, what happened here? I think you can get away with more when you are savvy and purposeful and know that you have a majority that will last for the long term. And when you have 5 votes, now 6 votes, you don't have to go fast. You have the luxury of time. I think you see the difference on the democracy cases and on the reproductive rights cases, right? Because the court hurried up on Dobbs. As soon as Justice Barrett joined the court, you really had a rush to get the decision that was won in Dobbs to overturn a Roe. And the Chief Justice clearly was trying to work behind the scenes to do his let's just drive to the same destination a little bit slower. But the conservatives on that issue weren't having it. I think probably because they'd put conservatives on the court in the past who they hoped would deliver that result.
They had the votes to achieve a long time dream.
And now they had the votes to go ahead and do it. But on these other issues, there's all the time in the world, and you might as well take it.
So in the case of Allen versus Milligan or Merrill versus Milligan, the thing that's at stake there is Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which is the part that says after an offense has been committed, then there can be review to undo the offense. And in the particular, now Shelby County was pre-clearance, where you had to say, may I, in advance to the Department of Justice. And so that went away in Shelby County. Now, the Milligan case is addressing the offense afterwards. And as you say, there's multiple racial gerrymandering cases coming up now. Louisiana, Georgia, probably Florida.
South Carolina, Texas.
Right now there's one in South Carolina at the moment. So do you reckon, it's because Louisiana has brought this up, do you reckon that, I would say that liberals are relieved that those cases can still be brought? And what do you think is going to happen in the next 6 months or whatever number of months that the court has?
I think these cases will be brought and they will be defended by the state governments in those states by mounting a facial challenge to the very notion of Section 2. And they will take Justice Kavanaugh up on his invitation, and they will argue in these briefs that things have changed since 1982 and that this is not needed anymore. As far as steps and then big steps, when the court undid preclearance and Section 5 in 2013, they assured us, well, things have changed in the South, so these handful of states no longer have to come to us for our permission before making any change. But there's still Section 2, and that's going to stay there, and you don't have to worry about that. But then they begin whittling away at Section 2. You had the Brnovich case out of Arizona a couple of years ago that did damage to a big piece of Section 2 as far as the standards for how a claim can be made. And this other piece of Section 2 is what's left. This is what this court assured us would remain in place. Oh, don't worry. Section 2 is still there. It can still catch things. Even though it's after the fact, Section 2 is not as good as Section 5, right? Because Section 5 stops it before it goes into effect. Section 2, you have to bring a lawsuit afterwards. It can take 2-3 years. It can cost millions of dollars. You can have an election in the state of Alabama on a map that lower courts found unconstitutional. And there's no, takebacks on an election like that. And control of Congress in many ways, could well have pivoted on a seat in Alabama, a seat in Louisiana, a couple of seats in Texas, a seat in Georgia, that had there been pre-clearance, had those maps had to be looked at first, the Department of Justice would have probably said, no, you've got to redraw those now ahead of the election. And that didn't happen.
Now there's these doctrines that have come up in the last few years. One is this equal sovereignty doctrine that you've described as basically coming up through careful excision. You know, in DNA editing, we're able to like do this, like just like take out the middle part, and what's left has a very different meaning than the whole stretch. And then there's the major questions doctrine, and I can't recall how much detail you got into there. These doctrines seem very new. So can we talk a little bit about the scope of what these doctrines may mean for Supreme Court power? Because I have this idea that the branches of government may restrain one another, but it strikes me that something like the major questions doctrine, is that an irreversible shift? Let's hear about that particular point of view.
The major questions doctrine really has been how this court has moved to block agencies and regulatory power and agencies from using the power that Congress has given them. And when Congress authorizes or establishes an agency, they don't give it a list of all of the things it can and can't do. They can't always imagine what is going to come up, but they, you know, the Environmental Protection Agency is there to ensure clean air and clean water, and they are given the ability to establish rules. And effectively what the major questions doctrine says is, well, if it's a major political question, maybe the agency doesn't really have that power, and that ought to go back to Congress and the courts, and we can strike that down if we want to. Well, what makes something a major question? I mean, I don't know.
Are you saying that there's no place in the Constitution from which this doctrine emanates?
There is not only no place in the Constitution where this emanates, it's completely made up. And a major political question can be generated with 24 hours on Fox News. You can create a major political controversy out of absolutely anything, especially when you've got the same foundations and the same funders and the same folks who give money to all of these media organizations and all of the organizations that create the controversies or set up laws in the states, who are also funding the campaigns to put these justices into lifetime appointments on the bench. I would say that that's all connected as well.
So all this is making me think of a previous era in the court. Now I'm going to take a rare step and mention a book that you didn't write. There's a book called Cycles in Constitutional Time by Jack Balkin. And he describes, I find it's a pretty good read, even for people who are not legal scholars. I'm no legal scholar. And he basically says that the Supreme Court over long periods of time has swung back and forth. If you look at the Supreme Court during the Gilded Age, the first Gilded Age, let's call the current age the second Gilded Age, the court did certain things, and then it swung, you know, pretty far, and then it became very conservative during what's called the Lochner era. Then it swung again towards the Warren Court. And Balkin's point is that one side wants to use the court as an instrument for change, and that's the majority. And the other side wants to keep things the same and restrain the court's power, and that's the minority. And who's the majority and who's the minority change over time. And so he takes a view that, well, in some ways, what's happening now in some ways is not that novel. And I want to use this to go back to the Warren Court. That was a time of huge change. Brown versus Board of Education, the doctrine of one person, one vote, and of course, later on, I guess post-Warren, see, I'm no historian, Roe v. Wade. But the idea being that those were big things that the Supreme Court did then. So And now, so why is this any different? What's different now in
Yeah.
what the Supreme Court is doing compared with what the Warren Court did?
I'm also not a legal historian, so the same caveat. But from my perspective, we have taken a brief moment in time that was the Warren Court, which is really about a 16 or 17 year period in American politics. And in many ways, it's at the heart, I think, of how liberals look at the Supreme Court. And I would argue that that was a moment that the Supreme Court had never truly had previously, and never had since, but that liberals, in a way, hold the court up and esteem it for that era, when really the court's true role has been much more revanchist throughout American history. And the comparison really that I would draw, and I think what we're talking about really here are the Reconstruction amendments that breathed life into American democracy, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which ended slavery, which guaranteed equal protection, and then
Birthright citizenship.
Birthright citizenship.
I'm glad about that.
It gave black men the right to vote. And the Supreme Court in the 1870s and in the 1880s really worked to smother the Reconstruction amendments and to smother the very idea of Reconstruction. You go back and look at the cases, whether it's Cruikshank out of Louisiana, which effectively ended the Enforcement Act, which Congress had passed in order to try and protect the new black citizens in the South. And what the Supreme Court said was, well, the state legislatures will just have to do it. The state legislatures were not going to do it. Or the civil rights cases, which were equally damaging and effectively set up Jim Crow, or the slaughterhouse cases. And that what you hear out of the court in those cases is something pretty similar to what you're hearing from the court now in these democracy cases, in these voting rights cases, in the affirmative action cases. And really, it's a question of how long. How long do we have to keep doing this? In Cruikshank and the civil rights cases, the justices are saying, gosh, it's been 15 years since the Civil War. How long must we continue to offer special treatment? And really, that is not that dissimilar from the Chief Justice in 2013 saying, things have changed in the South. Or in the affirmative action case, this is, talking about, how much longer? When will it end? And so I think the true battle has been between a Supreme Court that just wants it to end and a moment where the Warren Court tried to actually breathe life into the idea of multiracial democracy.
So there are these peak moments when post-Civil War amendments, these Reconstruction amendments became important. It makes me think about the idea that, let's say that we're originalists about the Constitution. There are different versions of originalism. There's the First and Second Amendments. I don't know, maybe we're worried about quartering soldiers or some other things in the first 10 amendments. And then there's this other period of things that happen. Like, it's not that our Constitution began in the late 18th century. It began there, but then there's this whole wave of change. I'm thinking of another book that I ran across recently by this law professor down the road at Penn, The Nation That Never Was, Reconstructing America's Story. And we were talking about this beforehand. And he points out fairly forcefully that there's this whole founding that we don't talk about, that the real founding document is the Gettysburg Address. the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And there was something new that happened there. And that's the real founding. And at some level, if we want to be originalists, maybe what we should do is go look at that. And I get the idea, like, it's also a kind of a short read. It's funny because law professors are not generally known for being brief, but sometimes they write short books. But he basically makes the point that there's this other starting point. So now we have two starting points. We have the starting point of the Reconstruction Amendments, and that's Kermit Roosevelt, that's the Warren Court. Maybe that's Ketanji Brown Jackson now, right, when she makes arguments from the bench. And now you're saying there's this other starting point. So how long is it going to take? Like, are these foundations being laid by the current court? How long are they going to last? And are we going to get another? Will there be a future era when the Reconstruction Amendments become relevant again?
I hope so. I mean, I think we need to look really seriously at how we reform the Supreme Court. I mean, I think that we need to be thinking, not about partisan packing of the court, but about how you restructure it so you fix what has very clearly become a branch that's just as broken as so many of the other branches.
I mean, I guess, if I'm going to step back, it sounds like at some level the real problem with the Supreme Court is that people are appointed and then they stay on for 20 years or more. And so it's like, in math, like that's integration. So there's like integral in the sense of accumulating over time. And so it's like this integral over time where other branches get elected every 2, 4, or 6 years. And then here's one that sticks around for 20 years. And so, I mean, I guess I'm of two minds about it. Like, we want the Supreme Court to interpret the constitutional laws. Is the problem that they're interpreting it out of step with what most people think? What's the real problem
I think the real problem is that the court has become, the court has been captured by interests that recognize that the court was the vehicle for winning political partisan victories that they could not win through the usual partisan process, and that wanted to put the brakes on multiracial democracy, and recognized that the court was perhaps the easiest way to win
and so we're in
those victories.
So we're in this sensitive moment because the demographics of the United States have changed since the 1960s from, say, being 80% white to 50% white. And as that diversity increases, then arise fairly serious questions about what it means to live in a democracy like that.
It's a big part of it, absolutely. Yes, I mean, the Northwest Austin case comes to the Supreme Court 100 days after Barack Obama is inaugurated.
I mean, if we're going to go there, then okay, let's take the affirmative action decision that just came out last week or whenever. That's a decision that does away with explicitly race-based admissions in colleges and universities. There's a counter-argument there, which is, well, race has gotten more complicated in the United States. And so in the face of that, maybe it's appropriate to step past that and to move to some other approach. So is there a way to, do you have a way of interpreting that?
I think we have a political process that could try to interpret that. We have elected representatives. I mean, I think that if we want to go through these decisions as a society, you have elected legislatures or you have 9 unelecteds, and which is the better way of conducting this. When Congress reauthorized the Voting Rights Act in 2006, signed by a Republican president, Republican Senate, Republican House, passed that House 390 to 33, passed the Senate 98 to nothing, and 9 unelecteds decided that they knew better, that the 15,000-page record that Congress had generated, that all the hearings that had been generated, it didn't matter.
So the problem in the case of the affirmative action case is not necessarily a change in race-based admissions policies, but weakness in another branch of government to step forward and find a way to be productive to write the next chapter.
Well, yes, but I would say that Congress did write that chapter in 2006 when they reauthorized it, and that the court simply
cut it off.
Cut it off. Now, they threw it back to Congress and said, if you'd like to try to fix it, go right ahead. And Congress is so paralyzed and stuck that they've not been able to. But I think that the court also understood that that was the case. So these days, when you throw something back into the political process, you throw it either into a broken Congress, or you do what Justice Alito did in his decision in Dobbs, which I think is just so deeply disingenuous, in which he says, we are not overturning Roe versus Wade as much as we are giving the issue of abortion back to the people and their elected representatives in state legislatures that we've allowed to be so wildly gerrymandered that they don't actually reflect the will of the people. And so what I think we've come up with here is a wildly engineered system for heads I win, tails you lose.
Pretty soon I want to turn this to the audience, but I want to take what you just said and pivot a little bit. I just want to say, in 2 weeks, we're going to have someone you know fairly well, Mike Parsons from Fair Vote, to talk about ranked choice voting and its implementation and campaigns in the states and cities. 3 weeks from now, we're going to have Nick Stephanopoulos from Harvard Law School, and Professor Stephanopoulos will talk about voting rights federalism. And these two speakers share in common an idea that's also in your book, Unrigged, and there's the camera, Unrigged, where the idea is that there's a door that's left open. Moore versus Harper has left open the possibility of taking these questions of voting rights to the states. And voting rights federalism is the idea that we hear about states' rights as being, in our history books, as being a bad thing. But as Professor Balkin has said, well, everything flips around. So, states used to be bad places to hold back federal power. Now states are a way to advance power. So I want to talk about this. That you wrote this and it came out 3 years ago. And I want to talk about some green shoots. And I want to get a feeling from you out of, okay, so the Supreme Court has taken some major national moves to do one thing to democracy. Talk about what's happening now around the country at a state and local level. I want to hear that side of the coin.
There are some really wonderful stories out there, but there's Rosé really soon. I wrote this book because I had written a book about partisan gerrymandering before that, and I needed to detox from it. And I wanted to go out, and I wanted to be inspired, and I wanted to go around the country and to see and learn and travel and embed myself with the people who are doing the day-to-day work of really building a democracy from the ground up. And what you see out there is just awe-inspiring. I mean, you can go to Michigan, and the story of how citizens in Michigan, nonpartisan way, stepped up and took back redistricting in that state, which had just been captured by partisans in such a way that the party that won the most votes in Michigan for 10 years never won the most seats. And that's a recipe for extremism and minority rule. And you had citizens in Michigan who stepped up and began circulating petitions for a constitutional amendment. They wrote the constitutional amendment. They went around the state. They collected 425,000 signatures. It was the first time in history in Michigan that this had been accomplished without paid signature gatherers. This was a truly citizen movement. And they won with 62% of the vote in Michigan in 2018. And the maps that were drawn in Michigan in 2021 were actually, for the first time in decades, reflective of the people's will. And this isn't about putting a thumb on the scale either way. It's about the side.
The side that gets more votes gets more seats.
Hey!
Novel. And so Michigan, in different ways, this has happened in Minnesota, Pennsylvania, Virginia. I mean, I would argue that when we look in the national picture, there's a fairly dour picture. But I remember writing a piece for the New York Times 10 years ago. It was called The Great Gerrymander of 2012. And as far as I can tell, about half of those states have a substantially better form of state government than they did before because of reforms, either in some cases lawsuits, in some cases commissions being formed. And I know that here, here in town, the Electoral Innovation Lab is now working on understanding how Ohio could be made better. So I feel like there's a story of positive change, but it's happening at a local level.
I think you can say that there's been a very positive change in Michigan. You can say that there's been a reasonably positive change in Virginia. Pennsylvania, certainly. And this was done differently, right? I mean, the story in Pennsylvania is a story of the state Supreme Court stepping up. The story in Michigan is a story of citizens stepping up. The story in Virginia is also,
but also, I mean,
citizens in the court together.
Now, these are all cases where the Democrats got it stuck to them. But there's also cases where the Democrats were not the stickies, but the stickers. So like Maryland, and now recently there's a court case in New Mexico. So it feels like this kind of empowerment of either empowerment of the majority or giving some voice to the minority doesn't have to be a partisan thing. There are courts that are reining in the majority party on either side of the partisan aisle.
It's complicated. There are some examples. Certainly what you saw in New York was
reining in the Democrats.
A New York court reined in the Democrats, as well they should have. The 25-3 map that they tried to draw was an abomination.
It was piggy.
But there's not, the court in Florida, meanwhile, the court in North Carolina, the court in Texas have all been on the side of defending these power plays. We'll see what New York does now, right? I mean, a New York's court could now allow for this gerrymander. It's all going to come back there. So we will see. I mean, Ohio, to me, is a really interesting story because you had a super courageous Supreme Court Chief Justice, a Republican, Maureen O'Connor was her name. And she stood up to Republicans in the state legislature and the governor who 7 different times sent gerrymandered maps to her, and 7 different times she sent them back.
But she lost because the state constitution there expressly forbids the state Supreme Court from redrawing lines. And so there's a loophole right there. And it feels like the action item there, particularly
the action item is fix the loophole.
Is to figure out a process that takes into account all the parties.
That's right.
Or both parties and independents.
I think that's right.
And so yeah, I mean, the team has been...
the process in Michigan was better.
Looking into that particular problem.
Right. It absolutely needs to be
Michigan,
fixed.
in some ways, is the poster child, the inverse poster child.
Yes.
Well, I don't know. The representative democracy that is missing on milk cartons in other states.
Right next door in Ohio, yes.
And then Michigan has an answer. Okay. We're a little, we've got a little bit of time. I thought we'd take maybe 10 minutes or so, maybe a little longer, to see if people have questions. And I think there's a microphone around here someplace. So what I wanted to do is perhaps open this up for discussion. Ethan will take the microphone around. So if anyone has thoughts about state reform, about the Supreme Court, if anyone wants to throw flowers or brickbats at Dave, if you get too mean, I will shield him. But yes.
I can take it.
Veteran journalists can usually take it. So let's see. Yeah, Ethan, maybe I see a hand there and I see a hand there.
So I'm thinking about how FDR felt his back was against the wall and he threatened to pack the court. How far, in your opinion, do you think we ought to let this go before we start considering alternatives? And could you comment about your opinion of term limits for Supreme Court justices?
FDR scared the hell out of him, right? I mean, FDR said, if you don't get in line with what the American people want, then I will do this, and the court fell in line and stepped back, which I'm not certain that this court will behave the same way. I mean, I think term limits are certainly a good idea. I think the idea of giving every president 2 picks and you have 18 years and they cycle through and everybody knows what the stakes are, and that's just sort of the way that it works. I mean, in 2016, we forget, even John McCain was saying, if Hillary Clinton's elected, I'm going to keep Merrick Garland's seat clear for the next 4 years. John McCain was as moderate as there was in the Senate at that point in time. So when you look at the structure and the demographics of the Senate with the filibuster and the number of seats controlled by smaller states and whiter states and where the population lives, that becomes a question as well. I mean, I think you could come up with a lot of different ideas. You could have a bench of 100 people and simply draw 9 for every individual case. You could have a Republican president appoint 3 and a Democratic president appoint 3, and then those 6 get together and come up with 6 more, and they have to find a way to agree together, and then 9 are selected. There's a lot of ways we could do it that would take the politics and the partisan sting, I think, out of this.
Let me step back a little bit, though, and point out that one could venerate FDR for action, or depending on who you like to venerate, some would venerate Lyndon Johnson. But these are presidents who had massive majorities and in Congress. And if you look back in history, again, I like these cycles in time. In the first Gilded Age, 2 presidential races were won by the candidate who won fewer votes. There were 5 or 6 close presidential elections in a row. The Gilded Age was a period of close partisan division, and there were good ideas then, which kind of showed their face a little bit in I think it was called the Mugwump movement, and then blossomed later in the progressive movement. Popular election of senators, women attaining the vote, prohibition, and then repeal of prohibition. But anyway, it was a time of change afterwards, and that required getting the nation off of a 50-50 point. So my own sense of this is that it's good to generate ideas about what could be, and then the question is finding a way to survive as a democracy until we get to a point when we can get whatever it might be, national standards for nonpartisan redistricting, electoral college reform, a renewed Voting Rights Act. You can imagine all kinds of things that government could do, or rather government should do if you are reform-minded. But right now we're in a period where the could is missing. And so I think that requires a certain amount of patience.
We're in this 50-50 moment, but more than 50-50 power.
Yeah.
The power is not distributed in such a way as to be proportional to where people are. So when you have presidents who lost the popular vote appointing 5 of the 9 Supreme Court justices, when you have a U.S. Senate that in the last session was 50-50, but there was a 41.5 million gap between.
But these happen when we have a 50-50 nation, when it becomes possible to win ties. Speaking of patience.
My question is really building, and I like your ideas on how to improve the Supreme Court, some of those thoughts, but I wondered what the possibility would be given how radical the Supreme Court is, if what would it take to expand the numbers of justices, given that Biden would win again and House and Senate?
I mean,
technically it just takes passing a law.
Changing the Judiciary Act of 1865. So I think it was 1865, a law was passed that fixed the number of justices on the Supreme Court at 9. That law would have to change.
Right. So what do you think the chances of that happening?
Well, I think get off of the 50-50 point. This is sort of the larger point that these things are very hard to change when government is designed, or the current design of government is to make it very hard to pass major laws. And so, as a counterexample, Dave mentioned Michigan. Michigan, Minnesota, and other states have implemented sweeping change in the last year or so after getting single-party control of government. But that's because there is no equivalent of the filibuster in those states where it's possible for the majority to pass laws. And so the downside of losing the filibuster is laws get passed more easily. And the upside is a chance of getting change and doing the experiment. Ethan, you're making decisions. Take it. Yeah, of course.
Hi. So I think first it's funny to think about this Reconstruction era of Supreme Court and the idea that 15 years between, I guess, from emancipation to some of these decisions was considered enough time for things to have changed. When we think about the fact that Obama was elected in 2008, and if we talk about things in like the presentist perspective, it's like saying you had a black president 15 years ago, isn't race over? But that's not my question. My question is more about the ethics of Supreme Court justices. I think that the recent ProPublica piece really exposed the fact that there is no ethical standard of conduct for these justices. And I'm curious, is this, I guess, breach of conduct something that is more recent with the Roberts Court's justices, or is this something that potentially has just been going on for a greater period of time, and now there's just more attention to the corruption there?
It's a great question. It's possible it's been going on, I mean, for longer than we don't know, because they don't have to disclose.
Wasn't Abe Forthouse like a
anything.
poker buddy of Lyndon Johnson or something like? I mean, like there were.
Well, that's why he wasn't.
He didn't make it onto the court.
He didn't make it on, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the point being that, like, which forms of corruption were present previously, and are we? Yeah.
But you know, there is one person who's always in the background of all of these cases. There's one person who's on the fishing trip to Alaska with Justice Alito. There's one person who's in the picture that's painted on Harlan Crow's Adirondack retreat. There's one person who was there with Justice Scalia on most of his hunting trips. And that person is Leonard Leo of the Federalist Society, and now the guy who controls the $1.6 billion Marble Freedom Trust Fund, who is also the person who has run the campaign to put these justices on the court. So in some ways, I think what we're looking at now is these justices are, it's like they've been knighted. And it's as if they think they can get away with anything, and indeed it seems like they can, and it's going to be up to us and Congress to try to stop it. Congress has tried to bring the Chief Justice in and ask him a few questions, and he has declined.
He would prefer
which
not to.
Seems to me to be the height of arrogance.
Yeah, it's funny that we have, we think in historic terms about Supreme Court justices, presidents, leaders in Congress, but you're making me think of this one figure Mark Hanna, who in the first Gilded Age, like, wasn't elected to anything, but there he was lurking around, pulling strings and making things happen. And it will be interesting to see your book when it comes out. When's the pub date?
Spring.
Spring of 2024, yes. When we can read about, like...
There won't be any other politics books out in spring of 2024.
Doubtful.
It's gonna be perfect.
Let's maybe, if you guys are patient enough, let's just maybe do a couple more questions, and then...
and there's rosé.
And there's rosé. Just
and dancing.
And singing, apparently.
I loved your analogy of the DNA editing, all right, which seems
That's
to be
his.
particularly execrable, rewriting and setting precedent from prior texts where there was no such intent.
Yeah.
Now, with that understood, it would help to understand if in prior periods this kind of stuff happened, and if there was any way of shaming these people at all. I think you kind of preempted me with this question of there seems to be no other recourse. So is there any other historically shaming incident about how terrible these people are?
Dred Scott, Lochner, what do we want to do here?
Boy, there have been...
Korematsu.
There have been some doozies, yeah. I mean, there's a handful of the really bad doozies that we know, and then there's all these Reconstruction era cases that they're not taught.
Oh, right. Like there's the antitrust laws like didn't get enforced
Yeah.
for a long time.
Right.
Like that. Like there were just things that happened, and almost certainly there was money involved there. It
Oh,
just feels like it.
most
Like,
certainly,
yeah.
right?
Interesting.
You know, I didn't show the slide. Well, I probably did as I was going up and down. You probably saw it a few times. You just didn't stop on it. But in the Shelby County case, Roberts includes a chart. And he says, here, see, whites and blacks voter registration is the same across the South. And in some states, a black registration even exceeds white registration. Except his chart was a lie. The chart came from the Senate Judiciary Committee report, which was put out by Republicans 2 days after the Senate passed unanimously the Voting Rights Act. So it passes unanimously 98-0. They all vote for it. And then they sneak out this report to try to bleed it into the record for the future litigation because they know that the strategy is going to be to vote for this thing because we're not going to vote against motherhood, apple pie, baseball,
So the chart
and voting
had
rights.
information that was false.
The chart had took census data and completely misinterpreted it. When the census sees race and ethnicity differently, so the numbers for white registration looked lower because it included Hispanic numbers. So when you compared actual non-Hispanic white numbers with black numbers, it was almost just as bad. I mean, not as bad as it was in Mississippi in 1965, but it was not the equality that the Chief Justice was trying to show. In other words, every single thing about this decision was wrong on the facts. It was wrong on the precedents. And is there any shame? No. I knocked on one of the justices' doors back when you could still do this a year or so ago, and I got one question before I was thrown out, and I asked the justice, Shelby County, do you have any regrets? And he said, no, that's a perfectly good decision.
All right. I think,
Rosé, dancing,
no,
singing.
I think there's a last question, and then
Great presentation. Enjoyed the conversation. Two things. One, I hate to quote Mitch McConnell, but he talked about how when the Democrats changed the rules on the number of votes needed for judges, do you think that Harry Reid made a mistake and that we should have kept it because that would have then required 60 votes for Supreme Court nominations and maybe we'd be in a different place? And
I mean,
second,
if you-
on the on the voting reform, which I'm all for and
Yeah.
love to see, but basically comes down to politics, right? All this comes down to politics. We got to, as Obama said, get our clipboards and our sneakers and go out and change things. Is there the only way we're going to change, for example, a gerrymandering and get to a national system like you were suggesting, we have to get Republicans to vote for it. Is there a conceptualization you have out there where they would reasonably see an advantage for them to do so?
62% of people in Michigan voted for this. You don't get there if you don't have Republicans voting for this. When you look at the numbers on these reforms, 60, 70%, almost across the board on these things. So, I mean, I don't think that these are red and blue issues. I think that these are issues that a lot of Americans see, red states, blue states, purple states. I think one thing we can agree on is we all hate gerrymandering. So I think that there is a way to talk about this, that basic fair play and still very much matters. We all want our vote to count. We all want to be able to throw the rascals out when they do something that we don't like. So I 100% that I think there's a way to talk about that. As far as Harry Reid, I am not convinced that Mitch McConnell wouldn't have done the exact same thing in January of 2017. So maybe Harry Reid got 2 years of judges he wouldn't have gotten otherwise by doing that. I think the thing about Senator McConnell, and I lived in Kentucky for a little while, is his word changes. So.
But there is a quantitative point here too, which is that it's all fine to talk about clipboards and sneakers and the passion of getting the vote out, but I think there's a role for strategery here, which is to figure out where the weak point is. If people feel a certain way on a single issue, then the weak point is single issue referenda and initiatives.
Yes.
If there's a way to get something through the rules of the Senate, do it that way. If there's a way to get something through court action, do it that way. And the difficulty is being strategic and understanding that it's great to have passion and it's great to have commitment, but you know what? 57% of the voters in Wisconsin can vote one way and in a certain way, and they would still not have a majority in the legislature. And the key point of weakness in Wisconsin is the state Supreme Court, which changed in November. And so the difficulty is in having a systems, I'm going to be the science nerd and say, have a systems level view and understand where to pour the water and where to pour the clipboards and the sneakers. And that's difficult. So I'm going to close by just saying that you had this story about a frog in water and it not reacting. I'm going to point out that the neuroscience in me is going to close this by saying that James Fallows from The Atlantic has pointed out that this is a myth. And that it's partly true. So a frog in slowly heating water will not jump out if you have pithed it. And pithing is a process where you go in and you take a probe and you take the higher brain and you inactivate it by going like that. And so it's only animals who do not have the power of their higher brain who can be boiled in this manner. And I think the metaphor here, sorry, this is too gross. Okay, so I'm sorry this is too gross for you, but the idea is use your higher brain and be strategic, and there are ways to make change.
Amen. Thank you.
All right, so rosé time. Thank you very much, and thank you, Dave.